Welcome back to Alberta Primetime. We, of course, heard from Maurice Vellacott before the break campaigning for a private member's bill for equal shared parenting. And it leads us to the growing debate over a perceived bias against men within the justice system pertaining to divorce, child custody, and even domestic abuse. Joining us this evening, Grant Brown, a former family lawyer, as well Dr. Amy KALER from the Department of Sociology at the University of Alberta. And in Kingston, Ontario tonight, Nick BALA, a law professor at Queen's University. And thank you all very much for taking the time. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
I'll start with you, Grant. There's obviously a strong contingent of men in Alberta across Canada that point to strong inequities, bias against men in the system. I want to start with divorce and child custody. What evidence do you have that there is a bias?
Well, from my own experience, I was a family lawyer for 5 years here, and I would show up in court and present, even when I represented fathers, for example, who were primary caregivers of their children. Suddenly the primary caregiver presumption in favor of them doesn't count anymore, and we have to look at other factors that weigh in terms of the best interest of the child. So what I would see very clearly in many cases was judges just reinventing the law when the facts favored the father getting custody.
So not necessarily in the form of the legislation, but how it's been delivered? Well,
the legislation is very gender neutral. I mean, there's very little in any of family law that references gender in any way, shape, or form. It's how it's applied that's the real problem.
Okay. Nick, is that a valid concern? Is that something that is going on in Alberta, in Canada?
Well, certainly that allegation is made by some fathers. It's also made by some mothers that the system is still biased against them. I think there's very little evidence of systemic bias. There may be some judges who are biased against fathers, some against mothers, but I think most judges very much focus on the interests of the specific child before the court and do their best they can to balance the interests involved.
Okay. Amy, as a society, where are we at in terms of the sort of traditional view of gender roles, of men being the breadwinner, women being at home with the kids? And do you think that translates into how matters are perceived or dealt with?
In terms of how matters are perceived, I would agree that there's a perception among, I'm not sure how large a segment of the population, that men may not be treated fairly by the courts. In terms of the reality, however, I'd have to go with Nick and say that I'm not aware of any evidence of a broad systemic bias against men. And in fact, if you look at the Canadian research over the last, I believe, 3 years from Statistics Canada, the majority of non-residential parents who are more likely to be fathers following a divorce say they're satisfied with the access that they have to their children. The majority of parents who do divorce have an agreement in place. They're not forced into anything by judges. So without meaning to diminish how bad it must feel for any individual parent who feels that their child is being cut off from them, on a broader level, I don't see that there is a broad systemic problem on a sort of population level.
Okay. Grant, obviously Maurice Vellacott, as you heard in the interview, he felt that there is an element of this that exists in the system. That's why he's put forward, for instance, this equal shared parenting bill. If you do feel that way, there are obviously people that disagree, I mean, here on the panel. Should we attack it from the point of view of legislation and make sure that whatever is the written law will ensure that regardless of the gender that there is a balance found?
Well, I compare it to employment equity laws in the 1960s and 70s. When women showed up to work, it was relatively novel back then. Didn't happen all the time. Employers would say, well, I don't really want to hire you because your chances are you'll get married, you'll have kids, you'll leave the workforce, I'll spend all this time training you, and then I'll get nothing out of it, and so on. Those attitudes, the way to get rid of them was to legislate them and say, no, employers aren't allowed to take those biases or prejudices into account when they make decisions. And likewise, in the case of custody, there are a whole host of prejudices and biases and orientations that judges learn from the Judicial Council, these courses that they take secretly that nobody knows really what's taught there. And judges are making up their mind on their own personal idiosyncratic philosophies on the basis of secret information they're given in these secret courses. And they're coming to outcomes that clearly don't represent society now. I mean, we heard Maurice say that fathers and mothers, dual income fathers and mothers, families, most families who both work, fathers spend about an hour less per week than mothers on average looking after the kids, which is pretty much insignificant. And yet that isn't reflected in the custody awards that are given in our legal system. And so, I mean, it's still about 90% to mothers when it comes to sole custody, 90%, or what I call primary custody, residential care with the mother. 90% to the mothers, 10% to the fathers. So there's got to be bias out there if it doesn't reflect what's happening in society.
Okay, Nick, your thoughts on that?
I think that there's some very misleading statements that are being made there. First of all, the vast majority of people resolve disputes, come to their own arrangements, and many of those people, now close to majority, do come up with some form of shared parenting, and I think that's very appropriate. But in the minority of cases, those high conflict cases that go to trial, a presumption of shared parenting would not be appropriate. I think it's very significant that the Minister of Justice has rejected the approach in this bill. I think it would lead to, and experience in other jurisdictions indicate that it would lead to more litigation and less focus on the interests of children. And I think that the allegation that large numbers of judges are biased is simply not founded. I myself have done some research. We've looked, for example, at alienation cases. We did not find, although alienation is a significant issue, we did not find any evidence of gender bias in the courts. To the contrary, found that judges were approaching these in a very fair and balanced way.
Okay, lots more to talk about. Great start to the conversation. When we come back from the break, we're going to talk about equality when it comes to domestic abuse and some stats that might surprise you. Stay with us.
I do think there's a very strong stereotype about men and what they experience. So a lot of people just don't see it because they think guys are stronger.
I doubt that there's that much of a double standard with regards to violence.
I think that feminism has improved so much that they demand a lot of things, but at the same time, the role of men has diminished, and we don't always get to see the fair picture.
I would say that it's more focused on women because I think it happens more, but I think there's still situations where it happens to men and it should be, I don't know, looked at, I guess.